And there we go. Thank you. So the research looks at lots of different areas of what culture issues there are. So some of it is around sexism. There's also been a lot of studies done that have looked at why women want to work in the mining industry, why they've stayed, and looked at underutilization in the mining industry. So but the predominant message is that there needs to be a cultural shift to attract and retain women in the mining industry. And I like to think of this cultural shift as inclusion, and it's the acceptance and celebration of differences in organizations.
Women.
So if we look at sexism in the mining industry, there's been a number of studies trying to look at this problem as well. And it's not unique to mining. Patriarchal cultures, male-dominated cultures may have unconscious biases in their systems that might inadvertently penalize women. And companies do have policies to try to prevent discrimination and harassment. However, there's still a lot of subtle sexism, and sometimes more than that that's happening. There's a 2010 study in Women in Mining did, and a more recent Australia study in 2017 that shows this is still a big issue. So these are some of the common terms you might see around sexism. So harassment is usually overt. Usually it's directly aimed at a certain individual. It may be repeated over time, such that it's also bullying. Discrimination is usually more subtle, but it can include exclusionary behavior, and usually it's directed more at someone just because of a category that they fill, so because they're a woman rather than at a certain individual. And microaggressions are brief, common verbal or nonverbal discriminatory slights or insults that could be intentional or unintentional. So benevolent sexism and unconscious bias would kind of fall into microaggressions. And benevolent sexism is when women are viewed in stereotypical or restricted roles, and sometimes paternalistic views are communicated to them. So the actions may not be intended from the person giving them as discriminatory, but they may be received that way by the person receiving them. So within the mining industry, there's another number of organizations that are working to get more women to mining and looking at some of the issues around women in mining. But these are two of them that are across the country. So Women in Mining Canada was formed in 2009, and we have a branch in Saskatchewan that's partnered with Women in Nuclear. Me Too Mining was formed last year, and it's looking to call out and have conversations around sexual violence and sexual harassment, intimidation, and discrimination in the workforce, whereas Women in Mining is doing a lot of partnerships, and they're looking to have people experience a better place to work where they can have all their possibilities, opportunities, and dreams be realized. So there's been a number of industry-driven and government-driven studies looking at where things need to change. And these are 5 similar theme changes that come out of a number of studies. So the first one being that senior leadership needs to drive accountability for strategies. So the first part of my study is really looking at what is this messaging coming from the top and how are senior leaders trying to inspire this change. The second thing is training their programs for employees. So this could be around unconscious bias training. It could be around specific training for women in getting into leadership roles. Leadership actions is looking at how individuals. Oh, can we get you to mute please on the line?
Do we have a microphone?
Somebody has a microphone. So leadership actions is looking around sponsorship and championing individual people. So it's looking at what individuals can do. It's not that somebody told you to do it. It's just something that they're doing anyway. Company governance would be looking at doing audits and checks for unconscious biases in systems and making sure that systems are free from any sort of biases. Public awareness could be companies and industry focusing on rebranding and having partnerships with maybe post-secondary institutions or not-for-profit groups. But there's gaps in the literature on how some of these recommendations have been received by companies and who's making use of them and if they're working. So my study will look at some of that as well. So lastly, before we get on to talking more details about the study, I just wanted to get you thinking about another time when the mining industry has made a big cultural shift. And I think a good example is around health and safety. So in 1998, the mining industry was killing around 50 people per 100,000 in Canada. And so we have close to 400,000 people that are working in the industry, so close to 200 people were dying. In 2012, that had been reduced to only 10 deaths per 100,000. And similarly, the non-fatal injuries decreased from 2,200 to 750 injuries per 100,000. And so this was done really with a multi-fronted strategy, this great improvement in safety. So regulators got involved, there was a lot of collaboration across industry, people were sharing information and learning from each other to prevent incidents. There was a lot of accountability within leadership to drive these changes. People were empowered, and there was awareness at the individual level, and lots of times there was legislation put in place so that people had an obligation to speak up and stop unsafe work. And it got so that we were learning so much from all these incidents that we even started tracking incidents before they were incidents and focusing on near misses to prevent these more serious incidents. So if we think about the health and safety triangle, we can also think about how we can track some of these incidents on the diversity and inclusion side too. And maybe you'd have microaggressions at the bottom, and then discrimination above that, harassment above that, sexual violence above that. So by learning from some of these smaller incidents and correcting some of these everyday behaviors, we can prevent some of the more serious things from occurring. So if we want to frame out the problem then, the problem is that we need to have a cultural shift within the mining industry. There's also a projected labor shortage with a number of or more experienced workers retiring over the next few years, and we can do this by attracting and retaining women to these roles. And we have some levers and constraints that can help with solving this problem. So the levers, a big one is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal that was set in 2015. And these goals are looking to solve a lot of major issues that we face as a global society, and one of them is gender equality. And with this goal in place, a number of countries and stock exchanges around the world have adopted regulations that now make it mandatory for companies to report gender data and gender gap reduction strategies. So we have some metrics and we have some data that we can use to help drive some of these changes. And we also have constraints because we have a very entrenched masculine culture within the mining industry. So that's one of the constraints that we need to work around and be aware of. We have a lot of change agents though, and the change agents are those individuals that can help to become aware themselves and then to shift the minds of those that they work with to welcome women to work in the mining industry. So my research design, my research was done in two parts. So the first part was looking from the top down, and my overall research question was trying to figure out how is culture change occurring to close the gender gap within the mining industry. And I'm focusing just on the Canadian mining industry. And so the top down was looking at what individual companies were doing and what strategies they had and how this was potentially driving change. So I took a look at the corporate messaging, and I did a rhetorical analysis, used rhetorical criticism, and rhetoric is just the art of persuasion. So I was looking at the persuasive elements of the messaging and how it might be inspiring change. And I also gathered all of the gender data on diversity and demographics turnover that was in the same information. Then from the bottom up, the second part was looking at the perceptions of the workers in the industry in response to these initiatives and just seeing how it was landing on them, what things were working, what things weren't. And so this was a nationwide survey done with current and former mining workers. So for the top part, top-down look, this was done first. So this was done about March, April 2018. And I listed a number of different rhetorical criticism methods. I'm not going to go through all of them today, and I'll give you a bit of an overview on the gender data as well. So I looked at 10 different companies, and these companies make up about half of the direct employment in the Canadian mining industry. So this was Barrick, BHP, Cameco, Glencore, Goldcorp, Mosaic, Nutrien, Rio Tinto, Teck, and Vale. And I had picked these companies because they were listed on some of the 50 largest mining companies in the world, and they all had a large Canadian presence. So I looked at over 75 documents, publicly available documents, career and people web pages. So career page is where you would go to apply for a job and see job postings. And some companies also have a people web page where they talk about the values that they might have towards their people and expectations they might have for their people as well. And I was able to see how this messaging might have changed over time by looking at 5 years worth of annual sustainability reports for these companies. So this is one of the rhetorical criticism methods that I use, and it's called fantasy theme criticism. And the idea behind it is that you code words based on if they are a character, a setting, or an action. So here's just a word cloud from each of the career and the people pages, and the larger the word just means there was more instances of it showing up. So we can see that a common character on the people page is we, as in the company. Another common one would be the people or the employees. If you look on the career page on the left, you can see you, as in a potential future employee, with a common character there. So taking all this information and distilling it down, the common theme across the industry was that companies were wanting to act as a good neighbor within their local communities and hire a local and representative workforce. So it doesn't explicitly mention gender, but we do know in Canada about 50% of the population is women. So it implies that there needs to be more women working in the mining industry. So when I looked at the messaging by company, I was able to see a little bit of a variance here. And so this is looking at publicly available information coming from the top. So this is from the outside looking in. So it's not to say that this is the same messaging that's maybe in the company, but from the outside, this is what I found. So about half of the companies had that same theme about wanting to be representative of their local communities. 3 of the companies had some sort of tie to either human rights or government regulations that had inspired them to get where they were. And there was a couple companies that I saw that didn't really have much to say around diversity and inclusion. They didn't seem to have a clear strategy on their website. So taking a look at the messaging in a different way, we can have some statements that are very direct and overt. So BHP's SMART goal around getting gender parity by 2025, it's a very clear strategies they're going for. In some cases, there's also some implied strategies, such as business case drivers are maybe required in order to move something forward, or that the government made us do it, or that there's really nothing happening at the time. And those may or may not be true. There could be other things going on behind the scenes, but those are some of the words that come up, and it leaves a little bit of ambiguity sometimes. When we look at the structures, it reveals some potential conflicts in the narrative. So if there's a large focus on women, what about men? And are they going to feel threatened potentially by not being included within the diversity and inclusion strategies and dialogue? If we're focusing on merit, does that mean we are not wanting targeted strategies? Or if we're focusing on targeted strategies, does that mean merit doesn't matter? And are people going to feel conflicted about that? If we look at health versus safety, often health and safety are paired together, but yet more of the focus is on physical safety rather than health and mental health. And so is there some potential conflict there and more discussions we need to have around that? And so the theory around second persona is potentially highlighting those disconnects between the ideal audience, those change agents that we want to have who are accepting of and committed to diversity and inclusion, which mining companies are maybe asking their workforce to be, and then the real audience who need to make the changes. So to do all of this, we have a wide demographic that are looking at our website, and we need to change all of this. And are we going to change everyone's mindset and change their beliefs and their values so that they will change their behaviors and how they treat others by a few short, quick messages on a website? Probably not. If we look at health and safety and how this was done, it was a multi-fronted effort and bringing a lot of different people to the table to help make it happen. And this is maybe something we got to look at here. A couple emails and a few one-liners and maybe aren't going to help change everyone's mind when we look at the wide variety of people whose minds we need to change. So looking at some of the gender data, this was the available information I have. So one thing, I guess, with the gender data, just before we get looking into it too much, so mining industry human resource data is based off Stats Canada data, so it's always a bit lagging in where the numbers are at. So this is their line, the big dotted one here is mining industry human resource. If we look at some of the individual companies, we can see some more recent changes and increases. We can see that Cameco has been pretty steady with having the highest number of women within their company overall over this 5-year time period. They're the top line there. So we can see that BHP and tech and Barrick are increasing over the last little bit here. But one thing about the numbers is it's really hard to find this data. Some companies report by commodity, some report by company, some report globally. So to try to see those small improvements, it's really hard to find the data. It's not publicly reported right now. One other thing that I saw is that the level of female turnover is still high, which to me tells me that inclusion isn't there yet, and the percentage of part-time work is less than 1% in some companies. So, but the materiality, the importance of diversity and inclusion has been increasing over this 5-year time period. Some companies hardly mentioned it 5 years ago, and now it's a big focus today. So that's an improvement. So just to wrap up the top-down look, bringing together all this information that I looked at across all of these documents and websites, this is where I believe the different companies maybe sit. And again, this is from the outside looking in. So there could be other instances happening within the companies where they're maybe doing more in certain areas. It's just not publicly available information yet. So the promising thing here is more than half the companies are on the upper side of the curve, and there's lots of good things happening. A lot of the companies that are on the higher part of the curve are doing a lot of public awareness and getting out and talking at conferences and partnering with other groups and that kind of thing too. And I think some of these companies too are probably in some ways are leading the way in different categories, but overall there just hasn't been enough time yet to see those numbers really improve that much where they need to get to. So next on to the bottom-up approach, and this is looking at doing a survey. So I had a survey that went out across Canada. I had just under 1,000 people that responded to it, and over 540 substantially completed the survey. So around 40% of them were female, around 60% were male. I had a few that identified as other, and I'm not going to show any of their details as we go through because I don't want to be able to identify anyone. It's very important to keep all the information confidential and anonymous. And there's about 80 questions on the survey. So I won't go through all of them, but we'll take some of the highlights. So just to compare the sample that responded to the survey versus the mining population, about half the people work directly in the mining industry, 15% formerly worked in the mining industry, which I think speaks quite well to the mining industry that they were interested in even answering a survey on mining if they don't work there anymore. The sample population tended to be a little bit younger than the mining population, but not too much different. And we'll go on to the next one. So the sample population, if you look at the table on the right-hand side, also tended to be a little bit higher education level than the mining population. And part of the reason for this is that I was targeting more the management or leadership level in mining and not so much the frontline workers, people on the tools. So it might have not reached out to maybe some of the unionized or hourly employees and was focusing more on management. So it went out through industry associations and professional organizations. And you can see from looking at the graph on the left-hand side that I had people at all levels of the organization for both men and women. So the first really interesting question here that I saw was asking the importance of diversity and inclusion to the people answering the survey, how important they thought it was to their senior management and to their supervisor. So first, looking at the person who was directly responding, women tended to feel it was more important to them than men did, although there were still a number of men that did feel it was important to them as well, but women tended to answer it a little bit more positively. Both saw that it was pretty important to senior management, but men tended to see it was more important to senior management than women did. When we look at the supervisory level, there was a lot of people that were unsure on what their supervisors really thought about diversity and inclusion initiatives. And this tended to be the most negatively answered one, especially for women. So more than 76% of people indicated that their company did have a diversity and inclusion strategy, and they tended to focus on gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, but gender was the most common one. So going on to the next, how are people being communicated to about diversity and inclusion? So what I see here is that it's mostly by passive means. So it's information being sent out on an internal or external website, it's newsletters, it's email. It's not actually allowing for two-way conversations and for people to maybe have their concerns or their questions answered. Management is more likely to talk to people about diversity and inclusion than supervisors are as well. Supervisors is the least likely group to talk about this. And there was no significant difference in how men and women answered this question. When we look at communication frequency, I also asked a lot of questions around health and safety as well. So health and safety, not surprisingly, people are talking about health and safety. More than half are talking about it every day. Most people are talking about it at least once a week, if not every day. With diversity and inclusion, it's more likely that people are talking about it monthly to never. It's not as common that people are talking about it daily. Only 3% of people talk about it daily in the workplace. So that to me tells me it's not as ingrained in the culture if we're not talking about it on a daily basis. One of the most interesting questions, and it was the last one on the survey, was looking at discrimination and harassment incidents in the workplace. And so I used the same criticism to code for character settings and actions, and I'll take a little bit of time going through this one. So I had 214 people responded to this question and shared their experiences with 240 incidents. And I broke it up into 3 acts. So the first act was the incident that occurred, the second act was potential speaking up phase, and the third act was the outcomes phase. So the first act, when the incident actually occurred, these are the word clouds just showing the aggressors and the receivers. So the aggressors tended to be male, and they tended to be people in positions of power. 48% of the time they were identified as someone in a position of power, either it was a client, a supervisor, or a manager. 84% of the receivers were women, and 43% of them told firsthand experiences. So it was the survey respondent telling their experience. So you can see there the biggest letter on the receiver side is I, because that's the people who directly experienced the incident. So roughly half of the incidents were discrimination and half were harassment. The incidents happened in the workplace 73% of the time. 6% of the time they were off-site, and the rest of the time people didn't specifically stay. When incidents were happening, 43% of the time it was comments, and 6% of the time it involved some sort of physical contact. 89% of the actions were sexist or sexual in nature. So that's the predominant incidents that are occurring in the workplace. When it came to the speaking up phase, nearly half of the people didn't share what happened in the speaking up phase. So those that did, 41% involved a formal complaint, 36% involved informally trying to deal with the incident, and 23% of the situations, people specifically said they decided not to speak up at all. In the formal, if somebody did formally report it, 30% of the time they mentioned that human resources was involved, and 19% of the time they mentioned that their supervisor or someone in a position of power was involved, although half that time that person was the aggressor, not necessarily a support for them. In informal resolution processes, 30% of the time it was a supervisor as well, and human resources was less likely to be involved. They were only 5% of the time if it was informal. In the third act, so if there was an outcome out of it, 38% of the time people didn't share what their outcome was, and that could be maybe because they don't know what the outcome was, or because no one had spoke up. 22% of the time people said specifically that nothing happened because no one had spoke up.
Wait.
In only 17... Can you get to mute, please? Thank you. So in only 17% of the cases did people actually say that the bad behavior stopped. In only 17% of the cases. One person said it wasn't dealt with, and in fact, I didn't realize how inappropriately I was treated till after I left the job. So 22% of people said that their situation was handled poorly. 11% of the people who experienced, who reported it, experienced some form of retaliation, and sometimes those people quit, and sometimes they left the industry too. So when we're looking at some of the former mining workers, some of those people left because they were discriminated or harassed. So one person said, I informally reported the incident to a previous supervisor who was uncomfortable talking about it and posed the question, what do you want to do about it? Leaving it to me to deal with a daunting and potentially career-limiting. I chose to let it continue. That's what they said. So it was just as likely that the receiver would receive some sort of retaliation as it was that the aggressor would actually be fired. So only 11% of the cases was the aggressor fired. 5% of the time they were forced to apologize, and 3% of the time they were forced to retire. People said when punishment was successful of the aggressor, it appears that there was due process followed. And one person said an investigation into the harassment took place, resulting in significant disciplinary action against the harasser. Throughout the investigation, care was taken to ensure the confidentiality, safety, and security of all parties involved. So what I learned out of all of this is that our current systems and behaviors don't really support the receiver speaking up, first of all, and they don't always allow for a satisfactory resolution of incidents. And I think if we have these incidents happening within our workplaces, it's not a safe place to work for women who are majority being affected by it. So the last thing I want to show here is just personal opportunities for discrimination and inclusion. What I found here was the most common theme was that people didn't see how it personally benefited them. So the most common theme was that there was no benefit. 44% of people said that. The next most common one was training and then flexibility. So there needs to be some stronger ties with some of those programs that are out there, some of the benefits and how they tie to diversity and inclusion strategies or gender equity strategies, whatever you might call them within your company. So overall, I have some policy and program recommendations. So I think it's important that employees are made aware of their roles and responsibilities to gender equity strategies, and part of that will help them realize what some of the personal benefits might be around it, and ensuring leadership is accountable to foster some of this two-way dialogue so that people can have discussions around risks and benefits of gender equity. I think if those discussions aren't happening, it's not going to help convince people to change their ways of thinking about it and change their mindset. Ensuring better accountability for resolution of discrimination and harassment incidents, and ensuring a transparent and accessible and known process around discrimination and harassment incidents as well. And I think there's some potential for using existing health and safety culture and systems as common ground for diversity and inclusion initiatives. In some cases, we could be using the existing systems for tracking those same incidents and still allow for some anonymity for the people at the receiving end, and it would allow for tracking resolutions as well. So I have a few communication recommendations just in terms of talking about these kind of things. So I think it's important to use authentic imagery of the workforce in your work sites. Some companies are doing this, and some of them, it looks a little bit artificial in what diversity looks like within their workplace. It looks like an image you could find on the internet if you Google diversity. So I think it's important that people share their stories on the importance of gender equity in their company and how it ties to those maybe greater societal goals like UN Sustainable Development Goals. Sharing your journey on how these strategies are being used and what things you're struggling with along the way. I think it's important to own up to past mistakes and discuss how you're dealing with them today. One thing that I saw commonly with doing a top-down analysis was that the industry was often mentioned on a company's website as a scapegoat, that there was unsafe work that occurred in the industry but not within our company, or harassment and discrimination occurred within the industry but not within our company. So don't use the industry as a scapegoat. Fostering increased frequency and opportunity for that two-way dialogue, and making sure that messages are tailored for those individual groups, because it might not take the same messaging to convince everyone to change their mind. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement to just build off some of the common ground that we already have in the mining industry, like the health and safety culture. People also felt that mental and physical well-being were equally as important, so taking some of those ideas and building off the common ground. So lastly, to individuals, I think it's important to recognize inclusive and exclusive behavior in your workplace and support people to become aware of how their behavior might be inclusive or exclusive through discussions. Encouraging empathy is really important for inclusion, so share your stories and encourage other people to share their personal stories. And so just to wrap things up, I think that equity within the mining industry can be realized when a diverse group of people are welcomed into a corporation. People who feel included in a company, who work in a supportive environment that's free from harassment and discrimination, and who are eligible for positions and advancement according to the same standards as everyone else. Ultimately, that's going to be known as a good place to work, and I don't think companies will have a problem attracting and retaining people if that's true. So I think inclusion, therefore, is a necessary precursor to realizing the ultimate goal of a gender equitable workforce. And some of these strategies around gender equity, it's just a maybe slightly easier metric to measure, but there's other areas of marginalization that occur in our workforce, and I think that by bringing forward inclusion, it's going to help all people, not necessarily just women. So. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
You just go to the next one.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I can do that. Okay.
So if you guys have any questions, if you want to type them into WebEx now, and I'm happy to answer them, or if you want to carry on the discussion with me afterwards, please email me as well.
So Jocelyn,
yeah.
What's your next step with your research?
Getting it published, I guess, would be the next thing for me. So I'm hoping to defend my thesis in the next few weeks. But in terms of further research, I had wanted to do some interviews too, because I think that would have allowed for just some clarifications. With the survey, you only get a chance to ask a question once, and then you just hope you get the right information back. So that would be a nice thing to do in the future, would be to do some interviews as well.
Is there potential to look at some barriers that exist within company policies and stuff that either promote certain set of individuals or create barriers for others?
Yes. Yeah, I think there is. And I had asked some questions around what barriers people saw within their companies as well. So some people, I don't know if we can go to maybe to slide 37. 37? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, it's very colorful. But basically, so on this slide, just looking at the differences between what men and women saw is that women didn't think audits were checking as much for biases in hiring and promotion systems, where men thought they were already happening. Men thought there was more happening with leadership training for women than women did. Unconscious bias training was kind of similar. Flexible work hours, people are taking advantage of that the most, and then the next would be parental leave. The one thing that was interesting from this is anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies. Most people didn't feel that they had personally benefited from that, so both men and women.
Jocelyn, is there any view to a framework for reporting? I mean, to your point on some companies report by asset, some by company, and rates. So is there any view if your comparators are health and safety or just financial? Those you don't get to choose.
Yeah.
So is there much of a dialogue around someone, i.e. regulated by the TSX, putting in that framework so there's no confusion?
I don't know what they're working on behind the scenes, but I think that's something that definitely needs to happen. There needs to be some more transparency around it, because right now, if you want to go find out how many frames, right pinky fingers in the mining industry, you can find that. If you want to see how many people were harassed or discriminated, how they were dealt with, you can't find that information. And even how many women work at different levels, I think that would be harder to find unless you had companies providing more information too. So there needs to be some more regulations to help bring that forward. Yeah.
So a couple of questions from the line. I'll ask a couple of those. First one is, can you share the PowerPoint? Or is that not possible yet?
Maybe not possible yet, but all of this is going to be in my thesis too, and I'm looking to put together a more summarized version. So if there's some key things that you would like to see in a couple pages, let me know, and I can definitely put that together.
Are you aware of any gender bias training or other such training that we could propose to our employers for staff?
There's a free survey that you can do through Harvard, and you can go and it takes maybe about 5-10 minutes, and it's a good one just to see what your own personal biases are. But I'm not sure. I know different companies have developed their own unconscious bias training. I don't know what's out there exactly that you could take off the shelf. Yeah.
Last one that's coming from online right now is, I'm part of a committee working on a gender strategy. Can you suggest any good courses or conferences to expand my understanding of gender equity and how to build a strategy?
Yes. So I know at the CIM conference in Montreal, there's a half-day session on Tuesday afternoon I'm going to be speaking at, and there's some other people talking about diversity and inclusion. And then the Mind Your Potential conference in Saskatoon on September 27th. It's on a Friday. We'll be having a lot of discussion around that as well.
Jocelyn, do you have any comment on the statistical or anecdotal about underground relative to open cut mining or something? I mean, there's a different, well, I'll say cultural dynamic in those areas. Is there anything from your work that's made you think about those elements, or is it more generic in that regard?
Yeah, I didn't dig into that specifically. There has been some work done out of Australia looking at that, though, looking at it, was there potential differences in different areas or where people might be more isolated if it was higher likelihood to happen, but I never looked at that specifically.
So nothing from your work or no specific leads in that regard came out of anything?
No, not that I've seen in Canada anyway.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. And most of the mines, are they surface or underground for Canada?
It'd be a bit of both. Yeah.
Jocelyn,
Yeah.
Question, as you may have gone through a lot of data, and it's just probably all not consistent data, but path forward, will you be looking into reaching out to the levers like TSX or others to streamline the data capture so that all the companies report in a set format that can be looked at?
Yeah, I haven't figured out who the person is to talk to get those changed, but no, I would like to look into that, because I didn't take you guys through it, but I do have some other recommendations for regulators on what changes need to happen, but I don't know who that group is that I need to go talk to about that yet, so I'll figure that out.
I assume that will be in your thesis, so people will read and.
Yeah.
Jocelyn, your research is focused on mining. Are there other industries that you know of that, in a sense, are leading the way or further ahead in either data collection, consistency in data collection, or just overall in a better space that, in a sense, the mining industry could look to or learn from?
I think there was one story I read or a study that I read out of Norway, and so they've been collecting gender data for a long period of time, but it was companies could opt in to showing that information, and they found where they've been tracking it they've seen improvement. So if they were looking at the top, they've seen improvement at the top, but then if you look at the next level down where they weren't necessarily reporting the data, not much change. So where there's data and where there's people focusing on it, we'll see changes, which I think is true when you look at health and safety and operations and lots of other areas of mining. But if we're not looking at the numbers, nothing's going to change. So.
Are there other industries such as the financial industry or other areas that you know of that have better transparency, or is really the transparency of data poor across all industries?
I didn't look into other industries to see if someone was doing a better job of transparency. That's a good question. Yeah.
Another online question. Any insights on how to make more men not only aware of poor behaviors, but also have them step in when they see them?
So I think it's making them be aware and opening up the conversation. If the first time they have the conversation, it might be a little bit awkward. So having that conversation maybe before the incident's there, so they're prepared for it, and helping people just be more aware of what good behavior or bad behavior looks like. So maybe if you notice someone doing something that you don't agree with, just having a side conversation with them and pointing it out so they are becoming more aware of their own behavior or other people's.
Have you seen any evidence of companies tackling the younger generation, so those elementary, high school students, to talk about this and work on the need to get women in mining, so get them up front as opposed to when it's too late in their career, they've already chose their path.
Yeah. There is some of that happening, but probably not enough. Yeah.
Is there any comment on mentoring? What might be a better strategy, and particularly if there's all that critical mass? And I read an article a week ago, I think it was someone out of the beauty industry gone to construction, and their comment was the mentoring was the piece that made the biggest difference to them. I just wondered if that's anything any particular organisation is doing better.
It's hard to see some of that because on the external information, they're not always saying what things they're doing. But I think mentoring definitely is very important. Yeah.
Jocelyn, what about retention? You mentioned it once, but
Yeah.
even for those companies that do well, I think particularly in the data.
Mm-hmm.
So you hit the rates tend to be based on, the data tends to be based on how many women are in at any given point in time, but don't show kind of a fairly terrible trend downwards on retention after so many years.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any data on that, or what has some of your rhetorical research? Like, does anyone speak about this?
It's hard to find the data to see all the improvements. One company I know, when I looked at it, tech seems to be doing a pretty good job with retention. They've had some improvements in that over the last few years. So that's one company that I saw was doing pretty good with retention, but I can't comment on all the companies where they were at, because some of them it was just hard to find the data.
More?
Yeah.
Online. With your analysis of the incident, was there a related time frame, or have you seen any trend, positive or negative, on the number of incidents?
For the women that were reporting them, that they tended to have experienced them within the last 3 years, within the last 1 to 3 years, and men, the women are becoming exposed to it usually within the first 10 years of their career, and men aren't becoming aware that discrimination and harassment is in the workforce till later on, and it's also not directly impacting them too, so they're hearing about it secondhand, maybe when they're moving into a leadership role, and then they're starting to hear about it, but it's happening to women really early on. So I think for that reason, it's probably important to have something in orientation that people know what their rights are and how to resolve those issues, because especially for women, it's impacting them early.
And the other one is, are you able to share some of the best practices BHP is using for their gender equity program?
Well, I have the right people in the room. If you'd like to want to share what's working. But some things that I saw, I think, that are good in terms of going back to my recommendations and sharing stories. I think BHP was doing a good job of, having senior leadership speaking up and saying, yes, here's what flexible work looks like for me, and here's what this looks like for me, and tying those things back to diversity, inclusion, and the overall strategy. So I think the storytelling was really good. And I don't know if you guys have other comments too on what's working well.
Well, I know that reporting for salary is something that actually seemed to make a difference, because I know there was a lot of questions around, are you sure that men and women are paid equally at BHP? And we were always told yes until the reporting has come out for a couple of years, and it was like, oh, actually, maybe we'll make some adjustments. Mm-hmm. So like you mentioned already, the reporting was a big one.
Yeah.
I think that one's important, so there could be other things to report on it as well.
Okay, good.
Awesome.
Good.
How do you define senior leaders within your sample?
I didn't really define it. I left it up to the people responding to say that, what senior leaders look like, but I would say that those are the people, in terms of how I was looking at it from the top down, it was the people in the senior executive roles, maybe at the board level or senior executive roles, the top couple tiers within the companies anyways, that can really make that direction and lead those strategies. But people may have interpreted it differently on the survey.
What role do mining associations, regional and national, play in the role of supporting equity efforts in organizations?
That's a good question. I think they can definitely help maybe with, Women in Mining, Women in Nuclear Saskatchewan is offering a mentorship program right now. So maybe filling some of those gaps and getting women paired up with other female mentors, where it might be difficult to do in a company where you don't have a lot of women at the top of the organization. So something like that might help. I think having conferences too, so people can get out and discuss between companies about what's working and what's not, is really important as well. So just allowing for those conversations to happen and that networking to happen is really important. Maybe in the future, they'll come out with some recommendations that might firm up some of the reporting and regulatory type items too. optional. They might not have teeth to enforce it, but maybe it'll get to that point in the future, so. Okay, yeah.
Is there any data about, gender-neutral PPE that supports or doesn't support women in mining? So if you're looking at those even true mining roles, and
Yeah.
it's hard for women to work in that kind of traditional role when PPE doesn't fit.
Yeah. I didn't look at that specifically, but I know that's something Chemical has focused on, and they've been pretty vocal about, and they said it took a lot longer to implement all of those changes to have PPE available than they thought it would. But I think they've been able to do it now, and CoverGals is one company I know that makes coveralls that actually fit women, which is nice. Boots is probably a bit of an issue. I know I've had to get custom-made boots because apparently I have child-sized feet. So if you want to get metatarsal guards in my size boots, you can't. You got to get them custom-made. So PPE is still a bit of an issue.
Have you done any research into the percentage of women that intended or planned to enter into the mining industry versus how many are actually in the mining industry?
No, but I think it would depend on the university how much they're actually talking about it. I know when I went through engineering, we didn't really talk about the mining industry, and we didn't have people from industry coming in and talking about what they did in the industry either. So I'm trying to change that a little bit by teaching a design class and talking about the mining industry. It's a mining-focused project. So I think awareness is an issue too within universities that students might not be aware about it.
And what was most revelatory to you from your work?
I think around the discrimination and harassment, that was pretty surprising to me that it was that bad, and it was that poor of outcome, I guess, for the people that had went through that. It's pretty sad. It was a depressing 3 days reading through all those comments anyways, and just seeing that same thing over and over, that nobody spoke up, nothing happened, nothing changed. And then to see that there was a number of people that decided to leave the industry or maybe even leave their profession because of what had happened, so. Yeah.
Was there any information, first of all, great work.
Thank you.
And was there any information on what companies or leaders could do differently to have better dealt with those situations?
It's hard to say because there's people were very anonymous in how they reported it, so I don't have 100% of the details on what went wrong. It's just one perspective. So I don't know, but I think making sure that there is a formal process that people are know and aware of. Again, if we relate it back to health and safety, if you had more than half your incidents not getting reported, would you be okay with that? If you had people quitting because of unsafe conditions, would you be okay with that? So thinking back to health and safety and what we would accept and expect, and then looking at how discrimination and harassment is being treated, I think that's where I found a big disconnect.
I have one more online here. What are the best industry practices in regards to the mitigation or elimination of the motherhood penalty?
I don't know about that specifically, but I think encouraging men to take parental leave and normalizing that is really important. I know I've seen men take parental leave and they've been impacted and they've received retaliation for doing that. So I think normalizing that it's okay for men to take it is going to help with women taking it as well. Then you're not looking at a risk of hiring a young person that they might have a baby and you just expect that they might have a baby and it's going to be okay.
I think there's probably time for only one more question.
Okay, thank you very much for all of your questions on the line. And again, if you have more questions, please send me an email. And I will be sending out some follow-up feedback too, just to get some feedback from you on how many people listened in and what you thought of this format. This is the first time we've used a WebEx style format for Women in Mining, Women in Nuclear for these lunch and learns. So thank you very much for participating.